From the fall of empires to the ideas that shaped our souls, this is history without limits. Welcome to Borderless Timeline, where history transcends borders.
The first beach landings in Normandy are only a few hours away. To ensure that the Germans have no idea where the actual planned invasion will occur, the Allies create one of the biggest deceptions ever carried out in military history.
I think one of the keys to the success of D-Day is actually this incredibly sophisticated and ultimately very successful subterfuge operation known as Operation Fortitude.
Operation Fortitude is a component of a massive disinformation campaign called Operation Bodyguard.
In order to secure the truth that the Allies are planning this massive assault for Normandy, they have to go through an elaborate series of lies to convince the Germans that the attack is coming at Calais. And it requires significant moving parts, a lot of details, double agents working for the British who have cover stories, and then all of those military assets.
To create the illusion of troops building up near southeast England, a phantom fighting force is created, led by American General George Patton.
We had intercepted a German communication saying Patton is the most gifted general, the one they're most afraid of. So they knew Patton was going to be the tip of the spear, the point that led the invasion. And Patton's fake army, it was inflatable tanks, balloons, wooden structures. It was like a Hollywood movie set.
In the months leading up to D-Day, decoy fleets of landing craft, simply painted canvases covering steel frames, are placed around the River Thames and other important waterways. Inflatable Sherman tanks are deployed and moved to different locations at night. Rollers are used to simulate tire tracks to keep up the pretense. To further ramp up the disinformation campaign, the Allies increase aerial attacks on Pas-de-Calais. They also hire an Australian actor, Lieutenant M.E. Clifton James, to pose as General Bernard Montgomery, the commander of all Allied ground forces. Dressed in one of Montgomery's uniforms, Lieutenant James, who bears a striking resemblance to the general, flies to Gibraltar and then Algiers, where he's sure to be spotted by German intelligence. It's hoped that the Germans will think Montgomery is in Africa. They won't be expecting the Allies to attack mainland Europe without him.
And we knew from our extraordinary level of intelligence that, in fact, the Germans had fallen for our plan hook, line and sinker. And those cannon, the panzer reinforcement, the big guns literally on Germany's Western Front were pointing in the wrong direction, in the wrong place.
There were multiple divisions redeployed to Calais. If they had been deployed at Normandy, that could have changed the whole nature of the D-Day landing.
But ultimately, the success of D-Day could be significantly set back if the bridges come back under enemy control. This is now a strong possibility, as just after 300 hours, the Germans launch another attack. The newly arrived 7th paratroopers are facing an onslaught from a well-armed battalion of the 192nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment. As the battle rages, the 7th holds their own. But it's only a matter of time before the Germans receive permission to mobilize their panzers, and there's no way the 7th can defeat them.
Every time they rebuff a German incursion, it depends on the toll it takes on them. As long as the toll is light, then you're going to continue to feel a series of successes, and it's going to strengthen your resolve and make you feel like this is doable. On the other hand, they're also in a hyper-alert state that is going to wear on them. This leads to what's called operational fatigue. The longer you're on, the more likely you are to make mistakes.
As the battle for the bridges continues, French families in the dwellings dotted around the canal and river take cover in their houses. One such home on the west bank of the canal is Café Gondry, which is about to earn its place in history.
It's a cafe which has served as a bit of a refuge for the German sentries who go in there to take break from their sentry duty.
As soon as the fighting started, the cafe's owners, George and Thérèse Gondry, took shelter in the cellar with their 2 young children.
Monsieur and Madame Gondry are actually sympathizers. They are in touch with the resistance and they've been handing over a certain amount of information.
The information that would be gathered in these types of cafes would be through the conversations that were taking place between the German soldiers. They were excellent sources of intelligence, and this intelligence would then be carried to the French resistance, who could utilize it themselves or transmit it across the channel to the Allies.
Not knowing who's prevailing outside, They're apprehensive when they hear a knock at their door. They're relieved to see 3 British soldiers. The Gondrés are eager to help the British liberators in any way they can, and the café is converted into an aid station as casualties are brought inside, away from enemy fire. Café Gondré becomes the first house in France to be liberated by the Allies as the beach landings begin. At 6:26, the Americans land on Omaha and Utah beaches. Their main objectives are to secure an 8-kilometer beachhead between Port-au-Bassin and the Vire River, and to take the Cotentin Peninsula to the west. The force at Omaha is expected to battle a single German regiment, but instead, they're up against the entire 352nd Division and suffer the most casualties of all the beach landings.
The way the German defenses were organized, one regiment would be in charge of this part of the Normandy coast, another regiment in this part, and so forth. Right where the Allies came ashore at Omaha, it constituted the division between 2 different regiments. So instead of fighting 1, they ended up fighting 2. But they somehow managed to come ashore and take the beach.
Having failed to recapture the bridges, the Germans try a new tactic.
The main hazard they had through the morning was from sniper fire.
But D Company fights back, ironically using a German weapon against them.
They bring the anti-tank gun into action and actually manage to knock out a water tower that they're convinced the sniper is hiding in.
D Company does their best to take cover from the snipers and maintain their positions, but they do suffer casualties, and the wounded are taken to Café Gondré. Thérèse Gondré is a trained nurse and works with the troop doctor to treat the wounded.
And you see this actually throughout France during the liberation. There's an excitement to help in whatever way they can, and certainly this is a great example of that, where she's there, she wants to assist, use her skills as a nurse.
But Café Gondré isn't the only thing to be liberated. Outside, Georges Gondré is digging up his yard, unearthing 90 bottles of champagne buried since the German occupation began in 1940.
We know from accounts of German occupation that they had a tendency to appropriate, basically steal, luxury goods. They certainly did not want the average French person to enjoy such luxuries.
If you're a French nationalist, what has happened from the time the Germans came in, that's not France. That's not French culture, that's not French life. And once the Germans are out, bring up the champagne, and it's sort of a symbolic acknowledgement that this is France again.
But for Major Howard, there's no time for celebration. He's worried about his second-in-command, Captain Prédet, and the other men who he now must report as missing in action.
The position of Prédet and the missing platoon is very hazardous because they're behind enemy lines, basically. You never know where the Germans are going to pop up.
After securing the bridge across the Dive River, some 10 kilometers east of their intended destination, Captain Prédet and his men continue moving, constantly checking their surroundings for the enemy, as they head towards Allied headquarters in Ranville. As they push forward, they face enemy fire from the woods. To keep his men safe from the Germans, Captain Prédet leads them off the road.
It's waterlogged, they're coming through dikes and ditches, so it takes Prédet an awful long time to slowly but surely work his way to the bridges.
An hour after the Americans land on Omaha and Utah beaches, the British and Canadian forces are faced with choppy seas. At Gold Beach, the British 50th Infantry Division decides that instead of using tank landing crafts 500 meters out, they will run their tanks to the beach directly. The British secure a beachhead and take out the big guns in the area with relatively light casualties. But the Canadians, due to land at Juno Beach, will be delayed until 7:45. In the meantime, the British and Free French forces are starting to land at Sword Beach. The British 3rd Infantry Division is tasked with the assault. Fortunately, German fortifications at Sword Beach are lighter than the other landing sites.
The Allies were expecting barbed wire and an array of anti-tank defenses, which is consistent with the Atlantic Wall. Well, it turns out the Germans don't do very much here, but their fortifications need to be cleared and secured.
2 squadrons of Royal Engineers work to clear the beach, allowing the troops to penetrate the coastline. Facing moderate fire from German machine gun nests, the troops advance to capture the beachfront villas and resorts with little difficulty.
Fortunately, Sword Beach is the beach where some of the fewest casualties are taken by the Allied landing forces.
Success at Sword Beach is critical to Major Howard and his team, who are waiting for these troops to relieve them. The men at the bridgehead are able to hear the landing action from their positions, just 8 kilometers away from Sword Beach.
Can you imagine? It's a sort of festival of noise. And you're sitting there, bedded in a gun pit under a bridge, knowing that you're outnumbered by the enemy, hearing your own guys at sea in the air overhead, doing what they need to do to try and make sure your gains are going to be held onto.
Amidst the activity, 2 Spitfires fly over the bridges.
And they amazingly drop the morning's newspapers, which of course announce D-Day. It's extraordinary the thing, isn't it? As they're making history, the news of that history is actually dropping down on their location.
With the quick victory at Sword Beach, the British troops begin their advance towards the Orne River and Caen Canal bridges. While the British are taking Sword, the delayed Canadians finally landed Juno. During the first hour of fighting, the Canadians face heavy resistance from the German 716th Division, suffering a 50% casualty rate, comparable to their American counterparts on Omaha Beach.
That stands out to me when I think about that day. Whose story ended on that beach for no other reason than they just happened to be at that place at that time, and the person who was maybe a foot or 2 to the right or the left, their story continued.
Once the beach is secured, the Canadian forces will move inland to capture the nearby seaside towns before pushing south into Normandy. At the time of the D-Day beach landings, Hitler is still asleep. None of his generals dared to reposition the Führer's troops without his permission. Vital hours are lost as the German Supreme Commander slumbers. The exhausted 6th Airborne Division has been holding the bridges for hours amidst enemy fire. At 900 hours, Brigadier Poet returns from Allied HQ in Ranville, along with Major General Gale, who had arrived in Normandy by glider just after 3 a.m. They brought with them the news that reinforcements are on their way, though it would be a few hours yet. Although cheered by the news, the troops defending the bridges suddenly have an unexpected and dangerous visitor. Plowing up the river from the Normandy coast, they spot 2 powerful German gunboats. All the victories and sacrifices that had been achieved could be wiped out in a matter of moments.
They don't have long-range weapons. They have hand grenades, and they have Sten machine guns, which have an effective range of only about 100 meters. So they can't hit the boat until it's close.
The lead boat gets dangerously close, but a weapon that had been successfully employed earlier is again put to good use.
And they open up on it, not with the anti-tank gun, which they can't swivel around to get into position to fire up the canal, but with up here, this handheld anti-tank weapon. And it's a brilliant shot, goes straight through the wheelhouse, explodes, knocks the boat out, the boat kind of slews round onto the coast, and they capture the occupants of the boat.
As the Germans are marched off to captivity, the second boat turns around and heads back to the coast. The bridges and beaches remain in Allied control, but German opposition is ramping up.
If you're the Allies, you're thinking that you're in a very good spot. The Germans do have people in the area who weren't on the beach who can certainly attack the beach or retreat and head inland and go to the bridges.
Just to the east, there are over 2,000 German troops waiting for permission from Hitler to attack. Other German threats are less than a day's march away. The 12th SS Panzer Division in the Lisieux and the Panzer-Lehr Division in Chartres. At 1000 hours, the D Company men on the canal bridge face another challenge.
After holding the bridges all night long, turning away tanks, turning away infantry, dealing with snipers, in the sky, a lone German bomber appears. They have no weapons that can deal with this. And the bomber flies directly overhead and releases a bomb, and that bomb sails directly down and strikes the bridge.
This is a rare bombing on a day in which the Luftwaffe was mostly absent.
The head of the Air Force, Hermann Göring, grotesquely mismanaged the Luftwaffe in all aspects, and he fell out of favor with Hitler as a result.
The whole Luftwaffe, which was the pride and joy of the German armed forces at the beginning of the war, has been really eroded and depleted. The Germans just don't have the capacity to churn out airplanes like they did in the early stages of the war, and they also don't have the pilots.
With 1,000 ships at anchor off the coast and thousands of men on a beach, had the Luftwaffe come in with bombs and strafing with machine guns, D-Day would have been a bloodbath.
But bombs are still dropped. D Company and reinforcements at the bridge do their best to take cover from the incoming bombs.
Can you imagine their hearts must have been in their throats, all that work for nothing, and then that, it's gone, piff, paff, poof.
But with incredible good fortune, it hits, doesn't detonate, and bounces off into the water.
So now you've got a number of very lucky events, so it's going to be a big morale boost, but you still have a job to do. But now you start thinking that you're lucky, that you're going to succeed no matter what, that you can beat the odds.
Even while the Allies are attacking in Normandy, they continue their mission to convince the Germans that an even bigger assault is imminent at Pas-de-Calais to the east. To reinforce this subterfuge, Allied aircraft drops hundreds of dummy paratroops in the area.
We had what were called Ruperts, like a crash test dummy. They would fly over a part of Europe in a bomber, put parachutes on these Ruperts and throw them out the window.
And when they hit the ground, they would trigger off gunfire and crackers. They even landed special operations troops to play phonograph records to make it seem like you could hear their voices, and incredibly sophisticated. And this, of course, happened well away from the Normandy landings.
The Germans had spotters, literally from Norway down to Spain, and they would see this and radio back, "It's here." I imagine the Germans charging out into the field and holding up these little dummies with parachutes on and being duped time and time again by it.
Around 10 a.m., Hitler finally emerges from his slumber, greeted with the news of the Allies' amphibious assault. He's excited by this news, believing Germany can achieve an easy victory.
I think this is the success of Operation Fortitude. He's still not entirely convinced this is the main landing. So although he does give the go-ahead for some counterattacks, he doesn't order all the other panzer divisions located further north in the Pas-de-Calais to move towards the Normandy beachhead. And this, of course, is another mistake.
But unfortunately for Major Howard and his troops, around midday, the Germans mobilized 17 tanks towards the town of Bénouville.
Imagine being out on the road to try to meet them and seeing these multiple-ton gigantic tanks with very thick armor and guns the size of a telephone pole headed toward you.
After hours of staving off attacks to hold their positions, the British 6th Airborne Division is exhausted and depleted.
Physically and emotionally, mentally, they would have been absolutely spent. And then you have 17 German tanks roll in. Must have been a very intimidating sight.
But although exhausted, the troops resolved to keep the Germans from retaking the bridges hold strong. As the tanks bear down on them, they manage, against all odds, to destroy the lead tank, using an improvised grenade called a gammon bomb.
A gammon bomb kind of looks like an oversized gourd. It's like a bottle, basically. And it is a hand grenade at the end of the day. The difference is that it can be adapted to have an explosion that's small, medium, or large, basically speaking. For things like tanks, of course, you're going to pack it full of explosives and it can do sizable damage, and it does the trick.
The other tank gets stuck in a traffic jam behind the destroyed tank, giving the men the opportunity they need to attack the rest.
They somehow managed to neutralize 13 of the 17 tanks. So yet again, they managed to hold the bridges. It's a 1 in a million situation, but they did it.
And it's at this point that Howard is asked by the commander of the 7th Parachute Battalion if he will send some of his men back across the bridge to help bolster the defense on the west side of the Caen Canal Bridge.
While Howard's men are covering the bridges, the 7th push forward to the town of Bénouville and engage in house-to-house fighting to clear the lurking Germans occupying houses.
There were frontline soldiers who were billeted in French homes. That's what occupying forces do. The Germans used those towns as defensive networks and also to rig them, to line them up with explosives so that you hinder the enemy's advance. So these towns become really critical.
Just after midday, the German 21st Panzer Division finally receives permission to attack the Allied forces advancing from the Normandy beach landings.
The Germans are slow off the mark. If they'd been allowed off the leash sooner, they would have had a chance to drive all the way into Sword Beach and possibly beyond.
The 125th Panzer Grenadiers are ordered toward the Orne River and Caen Canal bridges, but they are easily spotted by British troops. To keep morale high at the bridges, Georges Gondry has a plan.
In a very French style, the cafe owner brings out the secret store of champagne to celebrate the Allied invasion.
Gondry hands out the champagne to the British troops. This gesture is well received, and many of Major Howard's men find excuses to get their free drink at various points during D-Day, amidst constant enemy fire.
Probably quite warm, you'd imagine. Been sitting in the June soil. But anyway, any tipple, I guess, is welcome once you've been through a night like the 5th, 6th of June.
Major Howard and his men have been holding on for over 12 hours, but Captain Purday is still missing. Purday and his men continue onwards to Ranville, the location of Allied headquarters. On their route, they encounter elements of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion and are invited to join their attack on the German-held town of Bavante. But Purday declines in favor of bringing his men to the bridges as strong as possible and completing his mission, although somewhat late. After swift success on Sword Beach, the British push further into France, dealing with pockets of German resistance as they meet them. The troops are now free to head towards the Caen Canal and Orne River bridges and the anxiously waiting soldiers. Their arrival at 13:30 is announced by the sound of bagpipes, played by piper Bill Millen of the 1st Special Service Brigade, who had played his pipes constantly since arriving at Sword Beach.
I'm sure it was a very sweet sound for all those who were at the bridge to hear that and to have that signal that reinforcements were coming, but it also is a sign that what was happening at the beach had gone according to plan.
It's a bit of a taunt, saying we can do this because we're in control. We're going to keep these bridges. We're going to take back France. This is just the start of a whole series of dominoes, and everybody's going to be in a huge positive morale and a lot of happiness.
But the Germans still haven't given up. At 1500 hours, yet another gunboat approaches, this time from Caen in the south.
And they attack this with the anti-tank gun, because that can swivel into a position that it can engage the boat coming up.
They miss their first shot, but the second round hits from over 200 meters away.
It knocks out this boat, forces it to turn around, but it just goes to show how vital the capture and therefore the counter-destruction of the bridges was for the Germans. They realized they needed to knock out those bridges.
Through the late afternoon and early evening, German attacks on the bridgehead taper off. Just after 2100 hours, as hundreds of British airplanes and gliders are flying overhead, dropping men and supplies, the 2nd Battalion Royal Warwickshire Regiment of the 150th Infantry Brigade marches in from Sword Beach. Howard hands over the bridges, intact and secure.
They're finally relieved completely, and this is the moment where they can relinquish all responsibility for those 2 bridges and go into reserve in the town of Ranville.
And after briefing the new commander, Major Howard and his exhausted men are finally able to depart for battalion headquarters, a full day after taking off from England. When they reach Ranville, Major Howard is pleasantly surprised to see his second-in-command, Captain Purday, who has just arrived after a waterlogged and woodsy trek from Varaville.
D-Day is an overwhelming success. There are objectives which aren't achieved on the initial day, that's for sure, and there are mistakes that are made, but it is the beginning of the end for the Nazis in Western Europe.
Over 150,000 troops arrive on D-Day, and by June 17th, over 500,000 soldiers are on the ground to push the Germans out of France and move inland to liberate Europe. A month after D-Day, the 2 bridges are renamed to honor the British, who held them strong throughout the long battle.
The bridge at the Orne is renamed for the gliders, and the bridge over the Caen Canal is renamed Pegasus for the logo on the airborne uniforms, and the road leading to them is now named for Major John Howard.
For his leadership during the capture of the bridges, Major Howard is nominated for the Distinguished Service Order and presented with a medal by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery on July 16, 1944. The Gondrés continue to run their cafe, renamed Pegasus Cafe, to this day. Paraphernalia from the battle is displayed on their walls, including Major Howard's beret.
Pegasus Bridge is not as well known as many of the other stories of the Second World War, and yet it should be better known. The course of the Second World War hinged on the success and the incredible professionalism and determination of that small force of soldiers in capturing and holding that bridge.
Late 1944, as weary Allied troops edge ever closer to the German border, they can all but taste the end of the war. But before victory is theirs, the Americans will fight the single longest battle on German soil.
It's one of the largest, bloodiest battles of World War II, yet it's virtually unknown.
It makes no tactical sense. It would have been quicker to go around.
This was the wrong fight to pick, in the wrong place, at the wrong time.
Whole units are completely decimated. The responsibility has to be laying at the door of the senior commanders who are sending these units in to carry out completely impossible missions.
Well, the meat grinder. So many lives are wasted ultimately for nothing, but very few people know anything about it.
September 1944. The Allied pursuit of the German army has slowed down due to the distance from supply lines and increased German resistance. Both the American and Russian armies have their sights set on Berlin.
The Soviets are coming in from the east. There's desperation on the part of the Americans and the Allies. You got to get to Berlin before the Red Army.
Waiting would have cost them. That was the logic in the fall of 1944, is that if we wait, the Russians will be in Germany and even past Berlin, and we won't even be in the game.
From the western side, the next strategic objective is to move up the Rhine River and prepare to cross it.
The Rhine River is a deep, cold, wide river. Hitler is ordered that the bridges be blown up. You got to get to the Rhine before the bridges are destroyed. The other sense of desperation is this war is exacting such a horrific toll. Holocaust, civilians starving, soldiers dying on the battlefield. The sooner we can end the war, the better. But what General Courtney Hodges, who planned this, what he underestimated was the sense of desperation on the German side.
Commander of the German 7th Army, General Erich Brandenberger, favors falling back behind the Rhine River. But Hitler himself has assured him that reinforcements are on the way, and the Aachen region instead becomes increasingly fortified.
The US Army faces two problems in its campaign through the Hürtgen. One, this is the first time it's fighting on German soil, and however tough the Germans have been, they are bound to up their game when it gets to defending Germany. And the second problem is that they're up against a formidable defensive system in a terrain they simply have no experience of.
Located about 5 kilometers east of the German-Belgian border, the triangular-shaped Hürtgen Forest, known to the Germans as the Hürtgenwald, is 140 square kilometers of state-owned forest.
They're kind of straight lines because it's a managed forest, so, even if you were trying to run and hide, the enemy can conceivably see you.
In 1938, Hürtgen Forest is fortified by the Germans as part of their western wall, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line.
So it forms a near perfect canopy under which you can build fortifications, under which tanks and airplanes are inoperable.
But the man in command has extensive experience fighting through difficult terrain. General Courtney Hodges is a decorated World War I veteran and well-respected commander.
Hodges definitely knew a lot about fighting this type of battle. He's partially blinded during the First World War. He gets a Purple Heart for that action, and he throws his Purple Heart out because he doesn't think he deserves it. This is the mentality of this man.
he comes from quite a well-to-do Georgian background. It would have been natural for him to go into the army as an officer, but he joins up as an enlisted man. And so for him to go from that to Lieutenant General in 1944 is really pretty impressive.
In August 1944, Hodges succeeds Omar Bradley as commander of the First Army. With 250,000 soldiers, it's America's largest fighting force, comprising 18 divisions, subdivided into brigades, battalions, and companies, all the way down to thousands of platoons of a few dozen men. On September 14, 1944, the American 9th Infantry Division enters Hurtgen Forest. These few thousand men are the battle-weary 39th, 47th, and 60th Regiments, commanded by Major General Lewis A. Craig.
The 9th Infantry Division has been pretty battle-tested for a very long time.
Prior to Hurtgen, these units took part in long combat missions throughout North Africa and France and are severely depleted.
These battle-hardened troops have seen almost everything. They know what to expect, and now they're being pushed into the Hurtgen Forest.
Most military science says that you don't attack in a forest, especially an enemy who's very well fortified and well defended.
Which is the great conundrum for anyone who studies tactics. Why doesn't Hodges go around the forest is a question we still debate to this day.
It showed the American determination to advance. It told the Germans that they were not going to be able to scare the Allies away, no matter what they did. This was also a resounding message to the German High Command.
This is the mentality of one of General Hodges' closest advisors. Fellow World War I veteran J. Lawton Collins has distinguished himself at the Battle of Guadalcanal, and he's earned the nickname Lightning Joe. When Hodges plans to halt for 2 days to allow reinforcements to catch up, Collins argues to begin recon immediately. He sets the pace of the offensive.
And they're sent into the Hurtgen to see who is in there, if anyone, and try to pierce out the other side and hit that Siegfried line.
The Allies enter the forest with several goals. Pin down German troops to prevent them from reinforcing their efforts further north at the Battle of Aachen, and capture the town of Schmidt.
It was like a crossroads town. You could fan out into the countryside, and it was a great place to have your communications as well. So Schmidt is a very, very important position for either side to hold.
The 39th and 47th Regiments are ordered to divide and conquer.
A lot of military training is about following orders, doing what you're told, getting to where you need to be. You don't need to worry about what the goal is. You don't need to worry about exactly what's happening or what the overall situation is. Here is your job. So you're starting off in that type of mentality. As long as you and your mates survived another day, it was a good day.
The initial advance by the 47th Regiment goes smoothly.
In fact, for 2 days they don't see anyone, and eventually they spot a staff car with a German colonel in it, and they kind of report back, this is what we've seen.
And they find a lone German officer trying to figure out what's going on. So what do these men do? They take him prisoner, they rob him, and then they send him back to the German lines. They don't even think they have time to deal with prisoners. The 39th attacks through the forest and meets resistance. They do not have as easy time as the 47th does.
The Germans have had time to recoup. They're back behind their own front line, and they are digging in. It's one giant booby trap, but you're probably not going to lay the booby trap right on the edge, the further western perimeter of the forest, are you? You're going to bed in behind your own line.
The 39th Regiment begin pressing forward at Lammersdorf at the edge of the forest. But unbeknownst to them, they are entering a deadly trap.
The terrain and the forest itself is utterly impassable for the Americans to come in. The Germans had built defensive positions throughout, strewing mines all across the forest, building machine gun nests, bunkers.
They they start taking casualties almost immediately. This makes them realize that this isn't going to be a cakewalk through this wood lot. They don't know where everyone is around them. They don't know where the enemy is.
The Germans do not expect the Allies' attempt to breach the Hurtgen forest.
The Germans were dumbfounded as to why the Americans would do such a maneuver. They thought it was crazy, it was insane, and they could not believe their luck that someone would try this.
It must have seemed odd to them that this fortified forest, impregnable is what we'd call it, impossible to pass through virtually, is going to be the focus of an American campaign which up until that point had relied on armor, mobility and aircraft. You can't use any of those three things in a dense forest. It was like a gift to the Germans. I'm sure they were surprised.
The density, the thickness of this forest also undermines the Americans in terms of communications. It's hard to see, and radar systems, more primitive radar back then, aren't working properly.
At one point, the only sound coming over the radio is a German warning of Achtung, Achtung, as the nearby town of Zweifel sounds their air raid sirens.
As soon as the radio goes out, you're in a feeling of isolation, that you don't have any support, that you're no longer part of the greater whole.
Radios tended to malfunction regularly. Sometimes the battery would die out, sometimes the signal wouldn't get over a hill. In fact, one officer said that he had to resort to the old hand signals that they were taught in basic training to move men around the field in front of him.
What began as recon has turned into a full-fledged battle. The Americans are on the defensive and woefully undersupplied.
Americans and the Allies have pushed in so quickly that they have outrun everything that they need. They don't have water. Some men don't have rations for days. You can't deploy men into a force they haven't eaten for 2 or 3 days.
After 2 agonizing weeks, the 39th Division takes control of the town of Lammersdorf.
Huge losses for tiny gains, but the need to win, the need to advance was so overwhelming that these losses were deemed acceptable.
General Hodges has these objectives. He wants this town or this key intersection or this part of the forest. In hindsight, it seems rather arbitrary, and he is not willing to change his mind. The problem is at what cost? And the Americans are suffering thousands of casualties for each seemingly arbitrary objective.
By this point in the war, General Courtney Hodges expects the Germans to quickly surrender due to low morale. But this is absolutely not the case. The Germans have every advantage with the forest fortifications.
The way that I think most commanders would do it if they had a second chance was to wait until you had full concentration of your supplies and then to bring the brunt of your highly favorable ratio of soldiers and tanks and planes to bear and crush the Germans. It was a 5-to-1 tactical advantage in terms of military strength that the Allies had, and it's just wasted, utterly wasted.
The Battle of Hurtgen Forest is intended to build upon the successful push that began with D-Day. The Allies attacked the coast of Normandy in a massive amphibious assault of 150,000 soldiers. They faced resistance as they stormed the beaches, achieving victory, finally, on June 11th. This changes the tide of the war and provides the launchpad to liberate France and Western Europe.
We've got never-ending resources. It's just a matter of getting the resources up to the front. We've got almost 2 million Allied troops, match fit and ready to go.
The British Second Army liberates Brussels on September 3rd and Antwerp on September 4th. Hitler starts acting out in desperation. He appoints Field Marshal Karl von Rundstedt as the commander-in-chief of the German army in the West and orders him to attack the advancing Allies. Soldiers are called upon to fight to their death rather than surrender.
So many committed Nazis go on fighting right to the end, and I'm not just talking about the top like Goebbels, all the way down to the ordinary prison guards who will not let go of their authority and their murderous policies until literally the guns are taken from their hands.
With German forces decimated, their approach is more deadly the closer they come to defeat.
Hitler informed all of his commanders that if they gave up ground, many of them would be dead. You weren't supposed to give ground. You were supposed to hold your ground at all costs, especially when you got to the Siegfried Line, because that's German territory. So Hitler says that you will be killed if you fall back.
On the German side, it's desperate. There is no choice. You're probably going to die fighting, but you fight. Because if not, you're going to get a gun in your back, or you're going to be court-martialed and killed. And these little kids, these older men, by now they're recruiting middle-aged men as well, they're going to damn well do what they're told. This is Hitler's Germany. You don't have a choice. You know, you dig in and protect your country.
The Americans decide to push through the northeast to capture the towns of Hürtgen and Kleinhau. But the number of American soldiers in the Hürtgen is quickly depleting, and the mood is grim. General Hodges calls in tanks from the 3rd Armored Division to support the 39th and 60th Regiments. The tanks must overcome fortifications known as Dragon's Teeth, just to reach the embattled troops.
Armored divisions were trying to get into the forest to help out and support these American units, and men had to have axes issued to them from the sides of the tanks to go out and physically chop the trees down, because the trees were too large for the tank to run over, and the tank couldn't run over any of them. So these men have to go out there by hand and chop down a road.
What was General Hodges thinking when he was deploying the tanks? It's not clear why such a decision was taken, but the tanks were a resource and they were deployed.
What you actually got in the forest of Hürtgen are tanks being stranded in mud, broken down, being knocked out, and becoming a problem. You know, the tanks are attracting fire and causing casualties. Far from them being the solution to the problem, they actually make it worse.
After you've lost a couple of divisions, you might consider rethinking the game plan. But the danger is you think, well, I've already lost 2 divisions, I'm just going to keep going. You know, I'm going to reinforce that defeat. It's a classic military error that so many make. Hodges ain't the first and he won't be the last.
Despite continued heavy casualties, by September 20th, the Americans reach the Weser Valley, closing in on their objective, the Schmidt Hub.
Schmidt is like a merry-go-round. It's a kind of roundabout of death. All the villages, incidentally, have been evacuated. You know, you can't live there. It's not a place where you live any longer. It's just a bunch of rubble. It's just a place where you might get picked off by sniper fire if a pillbox hasn't taken you out first, if you haven't stumbled over a dragon's tooth. I mean, the whole place is like a landscape of terror. Can you imagine? You come out of the forest and you land up in Schmidt. It's like, my God, who cooks up a place like that?
The planning for the German defences go back to 1938, when they construct the Siegfried Line. Now, it's not used, of course, for most of the Second World War because the Germans are on the offence. But when they do come on the defence, all these measures they put in place in 1938 suddenly come to fruition and are incredibly valuable. They've been building bunkers and pillboxes so that they create a kind of killing zone in which it's going to be very difficult for you to get past.
And yet, Hodges and other top brass all believe that Schmidt is an important town to capture.
The question is, how do you get there? You've got to come through the wood, funneling you into a field of fire in which you're going to find it very difficult to maneuver. The logic of attacking Schmidt gets completely removed when you think that a flanking attack could have done the same thing.
October 6th marks the Americans' first attack on Schmidt. Between October 6th to 16th, the 9th Infantry Division gains 3,000 meters at a cost of 4,500 casualties.
This is First World War numbers. This is losing a man for every meter and a half. It's a crazy number to think, how can this persist? How can you have all these losses and not see that we have a problem?
Bullets and tree shrapnel decimate the 9th Division.
Those kind of losses that the Americans absorb in Schmidt are monstrous. So you waste thousands of lives over a multi-day fight for nothing. Schmidt's important to the overall offensive on the Westfall, but not at that cost.
The battle to take Schmidt is a failure, but despite the beatings, the Americans do advance to the crucial supply hub of Monschau. But again, they pay a high price. The 9th Infantry Division is reduced to a small fraction of itself and cannot continue fighting in the forest. On October 16th, the nearly obliterated 9th Division gets some relief. 1st Army Commander Courtney Hodges calls on Major General Norman Dutch Coda to renew the drive toward Schmidt.
The 28th Infantry Division arrives in Hürtgen, and they dive into the woods. These are men of the old Pennsylvania National Guard, and they are sent into the woods to try to break this stalemate. They think they're going to be able to do it. They're battle hardened, they're ready to go. They get into the woods, and they see the destruction from months of terrible fighting. You are literally stepping on the bodies of men who died a week beforehand. It hits you in the psyche when you think about what these men are treading on, laying upon, being around every single day in the Hürtgen.
Fresh from his triumph at Omaha Beach, Dutch Coda has become accustomed to victory. But the German defenses here are surprisingly strong. Pillbox attacks prove to be deadly. American losses reach the thousands in a matter of days.
For those who were in Hürtgen Forest, the entire world is reduced to basically a green inferno, a meat grinder.
On October 18th, a battalion from the 28th Infantry Division arrives in Aachen as reinforcements. And after a brutal battle, the Germans capitulate on October 21st. After Aachen is captured, the 28th Infantry breach the Siegfried Line in the Stolberg Corridor. General Hodges' men are to press forward 10 miles to the Ruhr River, capture the town of Düren, before continuing to Cologne and the Rhine.
The war at this point, from an Allied point of view, is we need the Germans to surrender. We need them to realize the war's over. If Germany doesn't have access to its industrial heartland, then it's hobbled. It will have to capitulate. So that's a very clear, clean target, really.
So there is this huge push to move forward into the Ruhr. A lot of the power plants are located downriver. It runs Germany. If you can take out that area, you can seal off that asset. If you don't do that, Germany still has a lifeline.
But General Hodges continues to pursue other, less productive goals. He insists on repeated attempts to capture the town of Schmidt, an ongoing goal that is as elusive as it is deadly.
It becomes sort of myopic obsession to capture it, and then guess what? To recapture it. You know, if you've got compromised supply lines, it's very difficult to hold a place like Schmidt. You're making incremental gains and you're losing them again. One step forward, two back. One step forward, two back. And it's losses on a scale that the Americans weren't used to.
On November 2nd, the Americans begin their second attack on Schmidt, led by the 28th Division.
There's no way that they didn't know how bloody and painful it was after the first group went in. If you were a new battalion coming in, you saw thousands coming back out as 300.
The Americans spent much of October in desperation trying to take this small village of Schmidt and suffered thousands of casualties. What do? They try it again in November.
On November 3rd, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 112th Infantry Regiment move across the Kahl Valley in hopes of capturing Kammerscheidt and Schmidt and cutting the Germans off from their supplies. However, the terrain of the Kahl Trail makes movement of any kind very difficult.
One particular unit, 2,000 strong, is eventually battered down to just 300 men. Can you imagine a couple of days in which 70% are casualties? How do you rebuild the morale of that unit? It's almost impossible.
After their first loss at Schmidt, the Germans rely heavily on panzer tanks. On November 4th, the 166th Panzer Division tanks unload their fire on the 3rd Battalion at dawn, ejecting them from Schmidt and leaving them unable to counterattack. The battalion descends into chaos. 133 are captured by the Germans.
And again, you have to remember the Germans have had time to fortify. They've got back behind their natural defensive barriers. They've been given time to regroup. They've laid their hands on anything they can that goes up in a puff of smoke. It's just do what you need to do to keep them away, stop them getting across, keep them out of the fatherland, whatever it takes.
Meanwhile, the US 109th Division is tasked with capturing the area north of Gurmeter. But within 300 yards, they meet an unexpected horror.
I don't know that any minefield is a pleasant place to be, but that one is just horrific, almost impossible to navigate through. So navigating minefields, pillboxes, trench emplacements, heavy guns, all becomes a grinder. It becomes the meat grinder.
The Wild Pig, or Wild Sow minefield, is one of the largest minefields on the Western Front. Mines every 2 meters stretch over a span of 3 kilometers.
Now, how are you going to get through that? It's impenetrable. So you literally have to crawl through and try to find these mines, defuse them, and keep moving while being shot at.
Ultimately, they have to resort to rolling trees through the forest to try to detonate the mines. That's time-consuming, it's not practical, and in a forest that's this dense and thick of trees, it takes forever.
Even after all of those losses and that loss of territory, machines, men, materiel, it's still crazy that Hodges doesn't understand the totality of the loss. It is a loss at that time. How are you going to overcome that loss and go back at the enemy is another thing.
Ultimately, General Hodges comes to his senses and approves the withdrawal of American troops from this little hub, this little village of Schmidt.
With Schmidt lost yet again, the focus returns to the Ruhr industrial area and the Ruhr River. There are 7 dams at the Ruhr River headwater for flood control, drinking water, and hydroelectric power. The Schwabenau and the Erf dams hold up to 40 billion gallons of water between the two of them.
That's a huge amount of water. I mean, if that had been released, it's a nightmare scenario. If the Germans had exploded the dams, the advance through Germany would have become not just difficult, but might have become a near impossibility.
On November 5th, General Hodges receives a top-secret memo from General Simpson of the 9th Army. He is to refocus on securing the Ruhr River dams before the Germans unleash a catastrophic flood. Hodges insists that the best path to get there is to continue to press through the deadly forest.
General Hodges yet again ignores the concerns of his officers and the intelligence that the Germans are considering blowing the dams to flood the entire region. His response is, damn the dams.
One of the justifications for going through the forest is to get to the Ruhr dams. There were 7 of them. And 2 in particular are so big in terms of the lakes that they've created that the feeling is if they're blown by the Germans, they're going to unleash a flood tide that's going to really slow down the advance to the Rhine River. And this is going to really impede Allied communication. So we need to get to these dams and we need to take them before the Germans blow them. But that doesn't explain the logic of going through the forest. Yes, the Ruhr dams are at the back of the forest, but they're not in the forest.
What I don't understand is why they don't go round to the southeast. If you look at the map, and then work your way downstream so that you incrementally pick off each dam that the Germans could have flooded you with.
Hodges created this sub-objective. I can do the dams, but I have to get to this point first. And that's where I see this real disconnect. When you're making a decision and you have a goal, you tend to plan to get to that goal. Most people want to plan to get to that goal with the least steps possible. Hodges is planning to get to that goal by adding additional intermediary steps. And the only reason that he's doing that is because those were the steps he took when he was successful in World War I. You take the towns, you move the line, and that's what he was trained in, that's what he was successful with, and that's what he's repeating here.
At age 57, Hodges is not the man he once was, mentally or physically.
Because of his disconnection from those around him, he's not hearing alternate plans or alternate viewpoints, which is leading into tunnel vision for his overall strategy.
Hodges, he misunderstands his soldiers. I think there's almost a kind of a failure of empathy at this point. But for him to keep asking this of them and to not step back, it's a profound failure on his part, on a human level.
Hodges is an interesting character when it comes to casualties. He's very hard as a commander and likes to drive and keep moving and keep moving. But his men often say that they've watched him break down when he goes to the hospitals. Any other time, he's hard as a rock. But when he goes into the medical tents and sees the men, he breaks down and cries.
But meanwhile, the Americans are having a horrible time in the Call Trail.
Sending in tanks is not a good idea. It's an even worse idea when the weather conditions worsen. You get a lot of rain coming in. There's a morass on the floor of the forest, and the tanks are just incapable of moving and operating. You either got to get past them, you've got to go and rescue people out of them.
Amidst heavy casualties on both sides, a small glimmer of humanity comes from an unexpected place. German troop doctor Gunther Stütgen has a history of treating enemy wounded at his field hospitals. On November 7th, he makes contact with American medical personnel and negotiates what will become the first of 3 ceasefires. Combat stops for several hours, so wounded can be retrieved and enemy patients exchanged. Hundreds of men survive the Hurtgen forest, who would have otherwise been left to die. Years later, Stütgen was honored for his actions, which, he explained, came from respect that only soldiers who know the horror of war can have for one another. But in November 44, after the briefest of pauses, those horrors continue unabated.
The weather works to the advantage of the Nazis as well. It becomes brutally cold. It snows. The Germans laid thousands of mines down the Americans couldn't see or detect. So everything about the forest worked to the advantage of the Nazis and worked against the American invaders.
The American offensive force begins to be affected by a defensive mentality.
And they're going to be holding their ground, staying still, being in a covered position. You get that difference between being aggressive and offensive versus a very defensive type reaction where you're just trying to survive.
This reaction extends to some of the highest ranking officers. General Ralph Hubner leads the legendary 1st Division, known as the Big Red One. He makes the mistake, when reporting to Major General J. Lawton Collins, of using the phrase, keeping the enemy in check. Collins is furious at the lack of forward momentum and orders Hubner to ramp up the attacks. For Collins and his superior, Courtney Hodges, it's forward momentum or nothing. But by mid-November, there is plenty of blame to go around, and much of it is laid at the feet of General Norman Dutch Coda. His 28th Infantry Division is relieved of duty, and the 8th Infantry Division is brought in. On November 16th, Operation Queen begins.
The Hurtgen Forest campaign really occurs in a couple phases. The first one begins in September of 1944, and that's an unmitigated disaster. Finally, later in November, a second phase, Operation Queen, it's most of the same tactics, which again don't work. However, they want to try to use American air superiority, which ordinarily would make sense. But the forest is so dense, so thick, that it renders bombers and warplanes completely ineffective.
With no end in sight, the situation is reported on by one of the most celebrated writers of the 20th century.
Ernest Hemingway, reporting from the front for Collier's magazine, witnesses some of this fighting, and he's completely horrified.
Ernest Hemingway spent 18 days embedded with the 3,000 men of the 4th Division.
You have a kind of chronicler of the madness on a very personal level.
One of the grimmest actions is in late November when a regiment is sent to take the village of Grossow, and in attempting to do so, it loses almost 2,700 of its 3,000 troops. That's over 90% casualties.
And of the futility of the tactics being used by the Americans, Hemingway quipped that it would save everybody a lot of trouble if they just shot them as soon as they got out of the trucks.
And describes it as Passchendaele with tree bursts. That pretty much says it all.
You got shrapnel starting off the branches above your head, so if you're not hit directly, you're going to be hit with something raining down on you that's not just freezing, wintry water from God's skies. I mean, it's a nightmare. It's hell on earth. He's reminding people back in America that this ain't just headlines. Oh, Paris, Antwerp, Brussels, Aachen.
The city of Aachen was so well restored that refugees from the nearby internment camp were allowed to return to their homes in the city. The military government section went to work, establishing order.
No, Passchendaele tree bursts. You know, let's break up that narrative, that success story, and remind people success at a cost. Hemingway will eventually write a novel about what he witnesses. Across the river and into the trees, it's called.
A more direct literary account comes from a former professional wrestler, the machine gun platoon leader of Company G of the 121st Infantry.
That amazing character, Lieutenant Paul Bush, writes a great book about it afterwards. Incredibly visceral descriptions of what he'd gone through, what his men were going through.
Lieutenant Bosch's memoir captures the horror as he leads the 121st Infantry Regiment through the thick forest. Bosch sets up a command post and a carrying party to move rations, water, and ammunition for the regiment. German machine gunners catch them in a brutal crossfire, raining mortars and artillery. Bearing witness to the horrors of the forest, the 121st spends Thanksgiving in hell.
Thanksgiving in the Hurricane is a lot different than what you see on any other part of the line. It is business as usual.
On November 23rd, Lieutenant Bosch receives a message that a hot turkey dinner is on its way to every man in the outfit.
They were looking to build morale, but it's also a way to remind people what they're fighting for. The world is going to be safe, and your family and friends are going to be able to have Thanksgivings because of what you're doing here.
Bosch objects. The positions they are in are nearly right on top of the Germans. A terrible time to eat a hot meal.
And they'll know where we are, and they're going to shoot at us, and let's stay low and keep safe.
Despite his protests and appeal to reason, the Thanksgiving dinners are sent in on orders from headquarters. Privates are called back to distribute the meals.
Hodges is playing for a headline game, really. You know, the men were fed on Thanksgiving, you know, as a note home to mom, you know, I had hot turkey, whatever it is you eat, cranberry sauce. You know, there's a kind of, there's a superficiality to his thinking there. Did he really think a gimmick like that was worth any life?
The Germans are lurking closely, and the hot meal service draws attention to Bosch's men. Seven men are wounded and 3 killed. For a dinner no one wanted to eat. The 121st must move on after Thanksgiving in hell, but their journey deeper into the woods proves even more deadly. In only 3 days, the 121st Regiment loses 20% of their manpower, 50 killed, 600 wounded.
You've got mines going off, you've got trees exploding. How many times can you jump? How many times can you have that adrenaline rush before you've wiped it out? You just don't have the resources anymore to engage with it.
But throughout this vicious string of close-range firefights, Lieutenant Bosch leads his platoon in the village of Hurtgen amidst heavy enemy fire. He and his men take cover in abandoned houses, while automatic weapons clatter and buildings explode. In a brutal struggle, Lieutenant Bosch and Company G managed to take the town of Hurtgen, taking 350 German POWs. Bodies of both American and German soldiers littered the streets. For his role in the strategic victory, Lieutenant Bosch is awarded the Silver Star, his second one. The victory at Hurtgen allows American troops to begin to make their way to the village of Kleinhau, the next objective. The 121st Gains in Hurtgen finally placed the troops in decent proximity to the Rohr River dams, the objective all along of Supreme Commander Eisenhower. But the horrible cost to get there is barely reflected upon.
You've got this command structure, so there's this distributed lack of accountability for what's going on here. Nobody is saying, why are you doing this way? Even Eisenhower, who wants the dams protected, doesn't seem to get involved in how to get there. Maybe that's not part of his command, but somebody should have been tracking just how many lives were lost.
Instead of dwelling on the casualties, the First Army commanders seize on this momentum. November 29th. Orders from General Hodges come in to take the Brandenburg-Verstein Ridge, securing a launch position for the U.S. First Army to make a direct attack and secure the Rohr River dams. After enduring weeks of heavy fighting, the 28th and 121st Regiments clear the approach for the tanks to begin their advance toward Brandenburg-Verstein. The 28th and 121st Infantry reach the ridge, but the Germans have a major defensive advantage: positions on Castle Hill.
Castle Hill is one of the high points of the fight, and that's with no pun intended, because Castle Hill is high, and it's a great vantage point.
With only 11 tanks and 140 infantrymen left, reinforcements are needed to protect hard-won American gains.
The 2nd Ranger Battalion shows up. Very good, well-trained troops.
And this is where you get into differences between Special Forces and General Infantry, where there is more independence and decision-making, where you can adjust on the fly to meet a goal or objective without a very clear plan necessarily on how to get there. And so you find that Special Forces training tends to be very different in terms of initiative.
The 2nd Rangers begin their advance. They quickly overwhelm parts of the German defenses, and they will engage very violently and quickly with the Germans who are trying to defend Castle Hill.
The Germans fire on the Rangers with increasing intensity, but Company D takes the top of the hill.
The Germans were utilizing it to rain fire down on the Americans, and now it's in the hands of the 2nd Ranger Battalion.
Of the Ranger reinforcements, only 22 are still able to walk on their own after this battle. 19 are killed, 107 wounded, and 4 men are missing. But due to their sacrifice from Castle Hill, the Americans can see the Rohr River dams. On December 16th, the battered Rangers on Castle Hill are relieved by the 13th Regiment. But swapping Special Forces back to regular troops will prove costly.
And then they weren't using Special Forces. They were using standard infantry troopers who were trained to do what they were told, but they're doing it in an environment that is really biased against them.
The 13th are unable to hold on to this victory, but the struggle to control the Hurtgen Forest is about to be eclipsed by an even bigger challenge, and the Americans won't retake the hill until February of 1945.
One of the reasons the Germans fight as effectively as they do is because they are prepping for what will become the Battle of the Bulge, a position to the south of the Hurtgen Forest.
Of course, the bigger story is going to be the center of attention. The Battle of the Bulge became that center of attention.
December 16th, the Germans launched their last-ditch offensive into the Ardennes.
The Allied planners are completely caught off guard. They were not expecting this overwhelming German regrouping.
When Hitler orders the counterattack, the tanks concentrate their power in just one section of the line, which is an age-old military tactic. And if you can bust through that one section, it compromises the entire line. They've pushed a bulge out roughly 60 miles in the American line, thus giving it the nickname, the Battle of the Bulge.
On December 27th, the 83rd Division in Hurtgen Forest enters the Battle of the Bulge.
Both sides sustain horrific casualties. It's also one of the coldest periods of the entire war. The weather claims lives also.
But in contrast to the Hurtgen Forest debacle, Allied forces are now well organized and well supported.
By Christmas, we've got our act together. You're even seeing a change in the law in Britain where women are drafted overseas. We need to back up the boys. You need to feed the boys. You need to supply the boys. You need to administer the boys. And that's what wins the Battle of the Bulge, is this extra manpower, this oomph. Eisenhower comes up to the front, there's another 200,000 plus men. How can the Germans fight that?
Ultimately, Hitler's last-ditch gamble fails. The Americans win. That's really one of the last-ditch efforts by Hitler and the Germans to hold the American line.
The Battle of the Bulge is officially won on January 25th, 1945, but it comes at a high cost. Of the 500,000 Americans who fight, 19,000 are killed in action, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 or more are missing.
The Battle of the Bulge is a major turning point, and it is heroic. Churchill's right to call it a great victory, but you can't help but to think that at least in part, there's that horrible moment of Hurtgen Forest that kind of haunts them.
Finally, after 5 grueling months, there is still unfinished business in the Hurtgen Forest. On February 10th, 1945, at long last, the Rohr Dam is taken by the American forces. This gives them control of the Erf Dam and 20 billion gallons of water. However, the Germans rally around the Schwabenau Dam and blow the valves open to flood the area.
The Germans do exactly what Intel was hoping they wouldn't do. They blew the dams. But when the dams blew, it wasn't this overwhelming tidal wave of water coming down through the area like Intel thought it would be. It caused localized flooding. It slowed down some of the movements of divisions through the area, but it didn't cause this huge tidal wave of water. It was much ado about nothing for many of the planners.
On February 17th, the forest is cleared by the 82nd Airborne Division when they reach the Rohr River. The Americans are finally finished in the Forest of Hell, which claims between 35,000 and 60,000 soldiers missing, wounded, or dead. The Americans use their position at the Rohr to support an Allied attack on the city of Cologne. On March 7th, the Americans crossed the Rhine as their troops pushed forward to Berlin. 2 months later, the war in Europe ends. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe is officially over as Berlin is captured and Germany surrenders.
Hurtgen Forest is difficult when you think about the sacrifices made by the soldiers. On one hand, men died seemingly for nothing. But all this fighting, it did serve a role in the larger scheme of the Second World War. And ultimately, the Allies made it to Berlin and won the war.
What's most telling about this battle in terms of the embarrassment and the way with which it was fought is the amount of space that Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, gave it in his memoirs.
It is a story of the Nazi defeat on the Western Front.
He devoted under 70 words to a battle that went on for 5 months and resulted in between 35 and 60,000 casualties.
Supreme Commander Eisenhower has political ambitions. He becomes the 34th President of the United States and lives to the age of 78. General Courtney Hodges continues to be held in high regard until he retires from the military in 1949.
I think history has diminished his narrative because he's not the hero that we've come to expect of great American military leaders. But I don't think we can put it all on Hodges' shoulders.
J. Lawton Collins continues in the military for another decade and survives to the ripe old age of 91. General Norman Dutch Coda is denied further promotions. He's eventually pushed out of the military due to failing health. Lieutenant Paul Bosch survives the viciousness of Hurtgen Forest. His memoir and other written accounts provides a tenuous connection to this largely forgotten chapter of history.
The entire history of the Second World War has many omissions. Hurtgen Forest is one of the most significant ones, and it should definitely be more studied and more understood by everyone.
For a lot of the men who came out of Hurtgen, it impacted them for years afterwards, where they would talk about the bursting trees, or they would talk about the minefields, or talk about losing a friend in Hurtgen. Why is that important? Why should we learn from this defeat of the U.S. Army? Look at the men who were on the ground. I think it would shed a lot of light on what warfare was like, how destructive it could be, and how when you go into something maybe with not as good a plan as you thought you had, that it could have disastrous consequences.
Thank you for exploring the past with us. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe and join our global community. Follow us for more snapshots of history. And remember, the timeline has no borders. We'll see you in the next chapter.